Thank you, Hannah and Kathy and Miami, for inviting us to this. This is the longest, narrowest audience I've ever addressed. Hello up there. Like all of you, my life has been transformed by digital technology for most of my life. I began writing exclusively on a computer more than 30 years ago. The web was invented 25 years ago. I remember learning about the web 5 years after that when I was briefly the editor of a magazine. I published my first novel about 15 years ago about a married couple dealing with the dawn of the corporate digital age. And then right after that turned into one of my fictional characters by too easily raising too much money to start a website during the last digital bubble. A dozen years ago, I thought I was going old school. I decided to devote myself full-time to publishing fiction and to hosting this radio program on public radio. But of course, half of my book sales are ebooks, and half the people who listen to my radio program think of it as the podcast that they're listening to. And as the little girl in that first novel of mine asked her parents again and again in the course of the book about all the novelty that her parents were dreaming up, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Which is, simply put, our question tonight, I guess. Michael Chabon is one of the great American fiction writers of his generation, of which his Pulitzer Prize is just one measure. His novels include Wonder Boys, The Amazing Adventures of Kavalier and Clay, and the recent Telegraph Avenue. He writes screenplays and essays as well. Clive Thompson is one of the smartest journalists around, writing about the internet, about new technology, and its impact on people's lives and society. He has been a blogger on this subject almost since blogging existed. He is a columnist for Wired and a contributor to the New York Times Magazine. His new book, very much on point with our subject this evening, is called Smarter Than You Think: How Technology is Changing Our Minds for the Better. Someone who perhaps will disagree with some of that subtitle is Jaron Lanier, who is a pioneer, truly a pioneer in the digital world since before there was a web, especially in the worlds of virtual reality, a term, by the way, that he coined. He invented numberless pieces of hardware and software for which he got patents. He knows the digital world truly from inside out. He now, in fact, he's still inside as well as out, working for Microsoft Research, and has also, the last few years, become an important commentator and polemicist with his books, You Are Not a Gadget and Who Owns the Future. Now, unlike many and most such panels where all the questions are left to the end, the plan here is to interrupt a couple of times in the course of the discussion for your questions. There will be microphones, and somebody will run the half mile back there for you in the back to make sure you can ask your questions when the time comes. So, Jaron, I'm going to start with you. Networked computers and digital tools are making organizations and economies more efficient. They are enabling communication on an unprecedented scale among strangers and friends. They give us access to information and images and entertainment as never before. They are also, by many reckonings, becoming more and more quasi-human. So what's the problem with all that?
Well, the way I see it, the problem is what I'd call can we reduce the feedback any chance? The problem is what I'd call a zombie ideology. And let me explain that. Starting way back in the 50s, but especially in the early 80s, and then forward, there were a certain set of ideas that included that the computers will come alive, that widespread sharing of information will bring about widespread improvements in well-being, wealth, and so forth, and a bunch of ideas like that. And I like to look to empirical results rather than ideology. And although it's painful for me when the empirical results don't agree with the ideology, because a lot of the stuff I argue against these days, I kind of made up in the old days. So I'm often hearing tropes about this or that with computers, and it's like, oh God, yeah, I made that one up 30 years ago. And the problem with it is not that I disagree with my old self, but just that the results didn't appear. So for example, in the developed world, it just happens that during the same time that networking has become widespread, we've seen astonishing increases in wealth inequality. At the same time, we're seeing an astonishing lack of improvement, at the very least, at the very best, in the public understanding of science and acceptance of science. We're seeing some improvements, and some of the ones you listed are real. But the thing is, a lot of what we expected to see, we're not seeing. And what we've done instead is we've created a fantasy life in order to pretend that we can see the stuff we expected to see. So for instance, we want to believe we have these super smart computers that can translate our documents between languages, but actually we have to scrape literally millions of documents from real life translators every single day to come up with the example sets so that they'll continue to function as the culture evolves, which it does very rapidly. So it's a fake, it's not real. We like to have super efficient manufacturing and super efficient delivery chains from companies like Apple, Amazon, to name some, or Microsoft. And actually, there's vast camps of people who are treated, in my view, not well enough, who behind the curtain make that illusion work. The vast warehouses where Amazon pickers are employed to create the illusion of this perfect machine that delivers things to you, or the vast factories of people who assemble products. So in a sense, we've acted on a fantasy life instead of on reality. So the problem, there are many good things that have happened, and I certainly don't regret having contributed to bringing these technologies about. I think on the whole, actually, I'm kind of happy. I think a lot of great things have happened. But the thing is, if we can't learn to look at results instead of ideology, we'll really screw ourselves over worse and worse over time. So the problem, it's not the technology is inert. The problem is our own vanities. The problem is our own egos. And it's very hard to fight because there's this quality to this network technology, which is that if you can, without going into too much detail, if you can be on the winning side of it, if you have one of the central computers that's starting to be able to correlate data, so you have sort of a God's eye view on events in the world that nobody else have. If you're Google or the NSA or your bank or an American health insurance company or a botnet operator from some basement in Russia or any of a number of other parties, and especially if you're a financier creating complex bundled derivative instruments, all of these people experience this incredible rush, and I've experienced it personally, so I really know. I've sold a company to Google and blah, blah. I mean, I've consulted to the first high frequency trading systems and to Walmart and to everybody. I've been on the inside of all this stuff, and I can tell you that the rush of being on the beneficiary side of this thing is so intense. It's the fastest money in history. It's the fastest ascent to power in history. And it's impossible when you've experienced that. It's humanly impossible to see through it and try to get a better view at the time. It's a tremendous struggle. So I think we're asking almost a superhuman effort of our technologists to try to see through our own successes to realism, but that's absolutely what we must do. So I'm not anti-technology, I'm just pro-realism.
So it's an irrational exuberance. It's an irrational exuberance of which the people in the technology business, the winners, are still.
It's a subtle and technical irrational exuberance, and this is a funny thing. Once again, this is a very complex. Well, it's not a complex topic. Actually, it's simple, but it takes a long time to explain all the sides to it. But what we do with the big computers these days is a lot of statistics on everybody. We have fantastic statistical models on all of you that you will never see in the so-called open information economy. And what they do is they predict you, not that well actually, they're kind of crappy if we're going to be honest, but they're just good enough that we can gradually influence by just putting the right options in front of you, all those little link ads, just to influence your choices in credit, your choices in purchases, your choices in who you date, who you vote for. It's very subtle, but the thing is, it's like compound interest. It compounds over time. So it's just slightly better than random, but over time, it gives us an infinite concentration of wealth and power over you, basically. And so, I mean, just to put it bluntly. And in exchange, we do give you benefits, but they're the benefits of an informal economy while we hoard the formal economy. And the informal economy is real. It's cool. It's cool. The trust and the sharing economy feels good. There's a lot of positive qualities to it, but it's really not something you can rely on if you want to raise kids, and you might want to be able to get sick once in a while, grow old. The formal economy is what gives you the tools to deal with biological realism, what it's like to really live. But we all believe we're going to become immortal and whatnot, so we don't like biological realism. But here's the thing. Statistics are valid math. So whenever we do statistics on you or on the world or on anything, there's always a little bit of truth to it. It's always true that you can predict how something's going to go for a while. You can predict the weather for a few days, for instance. We can predict how to influence your credit decisions a little bit. But our world is not the kind of... If we lived in a different reality, then our ideas would be correct, right? Do you follow that? And so the kind of reality in which our statistics would be fully correct would be one where everything can gracefully morph into anything else. So here's a demonstration. Here's my hand. There's cameras watching my hand in this room, and somebody's probably hacked into those cameras who has some of these algorithms, whether it's the NSA or some Russian mobster or whoever. So I feel pretty confident that somebody is predicting where my hand is about to go, right? And so based on the predictions, my hand should pass right through my knee. But of course, my knee stops it. And the reason my knee stops it is that reality actually has structure. My friend and neighbor Kurt Andersen, who used to edit Wired, had this famous paper called something like The End of Theory, proposing that because we can do all this massive statistics, maybe we don't need scientific theories anymore. Maybe we just project everything in order to figure out how to make technologies. But that's not appropriate for the universe we live in. Instead, we live in a universe that's governed by what we call conservation and exclusion principles, which basically means it's a universe of structure. Now, I'm sorry to go into all this technical stuff, but what it really means is that every time somebody comes up with a perfect scheme to make money forever, like long-term capital management, Enron, bundled derivatives, the American health insurance companies creating a guaranteed profit by dropping people who need health insurance. No matter what the scheme is, and for that matter, the NSA trying to calculate perfect security, or Google, or Amazon, or Microsoft, any of these schemes to try to use statistics to make a perfect fountain of wealth will at some point hit the structure of reality and then need a gigantic bailout because they're too big to fail. So the thing is, it's based on this incredible power of vanity that's actually rational for a time. So it's not see, there is always this period before the hand hits the knee. There's always this period when it's valid, and when nobody knows how long that'll last. But it's always ultimately wrong because of the nature of the particular universe we find ourselves in.
Although, as we learn, of course, in the new economy, things are different this time. Clive, back 20 and 25 years ago when Jaron was inventing and enabling the fantasy that he now decries, you were a skeptic then and are now an enthusiast fully.
No, I think Jaron and I had very different voyages to this. You started off with a bunch of utopian ideas that you regret. What's that? Mic's not working? All right. How about that?
Here, wait, yeah, okay. All right.
Does that work? Is it turned on? Are you hearing me? There we go. Okay. So I was saying that you started off with a bunch of utopian ideas that you regret sort of turned sour. And I was exactly the reverse. I got online, I was a nerd kid, a programmer kid, and I started, messing around with BBSs and discussion boards in the late 80s. And in the early 90s, I could see the internet coming along. And I was horrified. I thought this was going to be an absolutely terrible idea to let the average person out there talking in public with all sorts of other people. Because, I was really misanthropic. I thought the average person was just too stupid. This was going to be nothing but, gossip and celebrity crap and dumb stuff, people yelling at each other, and no average person should be allowed online. Like many 25-year-old men, I had the world completely figured out from behind my desk. But I'm a reporter. I'm a magazine reporter, and so what that means is that whenever a story comes along, I go out there and I talk to dozens and dozens of people to find out what they're actually doing. And so every new technology that came along, whether it was like, something like, I don't know, Hotmail, or, this funky new thing called instant messaging, or digital cameras, or then eventually social networks and whatnot, I would sort of go out and I would interview dozens and dozens of people and find out what were they actually doing, And, always expecting to find, unbridled stupidity and inanity in front of me, as I confidently predicted. But I was always wrong. Every single time I went out there, I found that people were doing really interesting and creative things, using it to think in interesting new ways, in collaborative ways with people, sort of solving problems they didn't realize they could, hooking up and having conversations they didn't realize they could have. And I slowly basically was forced over 20 years of this to conclude that all the stuff that I was so confidently predicting at my desk that would go wrong wasn't going wrong at all, because people behave in ways that you don't expect them to behave. And in fact, they often behave in ways that the companies that make the tools don't expect them to behave. And so I gradually began to realize that what was really interesting and exciting to me was the fact that for the first time in history, a large number of people were able to engage in this type of public thinking that used to be the preserve of only sort of elite folks like scholars and journalists. The ability to talk with other people, to find other people who had the same ideas, to bonk them up against one another. This was happening on a daily basis. And I found this incredibly exciting. I still find it incredibly exciting on a daily basis. I think I couldn't agree more with you about all the financial dysfunction that's going on. Although I don't think it's because people are talking online to each other.
Oh, but it is.
In fact, I'm not even sure it's due to a lot of information technology. I think when you look at what economists are trying to pie chart, the reason why we're in such a malaise, there's definitely a role for mechanization of work. That's what productivity enhancing technology does. But one of the big reasons for the enormous, disparities of inequality that we have right now are just good old-fashioned political problems that were carefully created over 30 years by think tanks spending billions of dollars to deform policy, to destabilize labor, to change tax codes, to reify wealth amongst the top 1%. These are the big, powerful drivers that have got us in the political pickle and economic pickle we're in right now. They only have political answers. They don't have high-tech answers. To solve that stuff, we're going to have to do the same thing people have done for the last 100 years, which is to grab the political bull by the horns and fix it. That's my sense of the good and bad of what's going on right now. In some sense, I think you might be confusing a lot of old school industrial issues with digital ones. But I think we should probably let Michael have a crack at this one.
We have not heard the last of this part of the debate, but Michael, as somebody who I assume did not have an apostasy one way or the other on this subject, but simply let it come at you. First of all, what is your history of embrace of or skepticism toward this technology, and where on the cheerleader skeptic spectrum do you find yourself?
Well, the first thing I want to say is I live in Berkeley, California, where I'm actually a neighbor of Jaron's, and I'm glad that I do, because it's prepared me very well for feeling much stupider than the people that I'm in conversation with. Berkeley is a town where lots of advanced thinking is taking place at a very high level almost all the time, and I'm participating in very little of that. The second thing I want to say before I forget is I can't help, I will forget if I don't mention it now, but I couldn't help thinking as we were hearing about the Women of Tomorrow winning the prize, that for the other 4 organizations to also get funded, it would only cost $10,000. I'm a writer, not a mathematician, but and if somebody has 10 grand just lying around, they could just fund all of those other programs that lost tonight with one check. So just the thought. I had a teacher in my sophomore year of college at the University of Pittsburgh, a writing teacher named Eve Shellnut. And she was the kind of teacher who teaches by fiat and by pronouncement and by saying this is the way to do it and this is not the way to do it. Which I think can be, depending on the teacher, can be a very effective style of teaching, and particularly when that teacher, the way that the teacher's insisting that you attempted at is actually effective. And her way of writing a short story, the way that she insisted we write short stories was we have these things called typewriters, first of all. I don't know if you've heard of them. They had worked with paper, and you rolled a sheet in, and she would say, roll the sheet of paper in, type the first sentence of a short story, take the piece of paper out, put it next to you, roll in another sheet, retype that first sentence, changing it, rewriting it, add a second sentence, take out the piece of paper, put in another piece of paper, retype the 2 sentences you've written, rewriting them as you went, add a third sentence, and proceed in that manner with a fresh sheet of paper for every sentence till for at least you had at least a page, and it would be better if you did it for the first couple of pages until finally you just couldn't stand it anymore and you really wanted to just get going on the story. Then it was okay to just keep going. And I did it, I tried it, and it worked, and it taught me how important rewriting was, and that rewriting was an integral part of writing from the very first sentence, that you ought to be rewriting from the minute you begin, but it was so boring and so laborious and so wasteful of paper, which, we tried to persuade her. She was having none of that. She'd heard that argument many times before. She said, just use the back of something old. So that, this was about 1982. So in 1983, I heard about this thing called an Osborne 1 computer that was portable. It was about as like a portable sewing machine, a little bigger than a portable sewing machine if you've seen one of those, in a case with a handle, and it had a screen that was about that big, and it ran CPM, the operating system CPM, and it used this thing called a word processing program called WordStar. And a friend of mine got one, and I saw it at work, and I realized this is what Yves Shelnut has been waiting for, because this will allow me to rewrite from the moment I start writing without this horrible drudgery of rolling in and retyping everything over and over and over again. And it just turned out that the cost of the Osborne 1 was exactly how much money I had left over from my bar mitzvah. So I bought myself an Osborne 1A, and that was, like, I guess it was 83. And so, I mean, I had dabbled with word processing on the terminal of the mainframe of the university that I was at, but you're trying to write in a room full of other people. I couldn't do it. I had to be, in my underpants and stuff. That, I'm sure nowadays that's okay. So this was what I needed, and I embraced it immediately, and I was definitely the first person I knew to write fiction on a computer. And eventually people started catching up, and so I embraced it early for its obvious advantages, and generally speaking, I'm an enthusiast. I'm a Mac enthusiast, and I like doing things with my computer and playing on the computer and making things on a computer. All of my encounters with the dark side, with the negative side, with the painful, in some cases, horrible side, have come through my children and through their interactions on the internet, and with this, like, always being at least 2 steps behind the latest technology that's been thought up to make small children's lives a little more painful, a little worse, to take all these things that are inherently part of the experience of being 11, 12, 13 years old and just making them even more soul-crushing because more efficient. So I guess overall, and listening to Jaron and Clive, I think what I hear is just that the technology is inherently ambiguous. Its value, its virtue is inherently ambiguous because it was made by human beings, and everything we do is always that way. All the good things that we do are also all the bad things that we do, and that's always been true. I mean, and so I think of fire. It's just a perfect example. In discovering fire, inventing fire, whoever did that has a lot to answer for. But on the other hand, we are always going to be eternally grateful to her for having done that, because it's the perfect thing. It can kill you and it can keep you alive, and it's the same thing. And I feel that that's a hallmark of my favorite figure in all of literature, if you can call it that, is in Norse mythology, the figure of Loki. Who's so much more interesting than he is in the Marvel comics. And I say that as someone who loves Marvel comics and Thor in particular. But in mythology, Loki is not simply a villain. He's not simply evil. He's also weirdly good sometimes, or if not good, he does things that almost sometimes without his wanting them to come out well. And Loki invented the fishing net, and Loki brought fire, and he's this perfect, ambiguous figure of both the destructive and the constructive potential of humanity, and just everything that happens with the internet, the web, whatever you want to call it. It just seems to just reinforce that opinion in me, because it's equally horrible and wonderful.
Jaron, one of the persuasive arguments you make in your books, to me, is that beyond the political economy problems of people who do relatively little getting very rich from that, in the worlds of writing for people who are not best-selling novelists and Pulitzer Prize winners, and the worlds of music, the middle-class lives that had been enabled in the pre-digital age have been disenabled, and I don't see how a political uprising fixes that. I mean, that seems like a permanent new condition.
So I'd like to respond to all three things, if I could.
Sure.
To you, so a couple things I want to point out. I think our era of the moment does have a lot in common with previous historical eras, including the Gilded Ages of the late 19th century and the run-up to the Great Depression. But the thing is that we can now look back at those and reinterpret them in information technology terms. So for instance, the term computer originally referred to a profession that was entirely female, and there were enormous crowds of women employed in long row buildings, mostly in upstate New York and places in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, calculating business enterprise decisions for the monopolists and barons of earlier eras. And in fact, the correctives to excesses that created this period of stability in the 20th century can be seen very clearly as information management policies against such things as insider trading, or in the case of the government, sharing the FBI and the NSA sharing information, that sort of thing, which started to erode in the Bush era. As it happens, rather than being a theorist or a journalist, I was a direct participant and witness, so I feel I have some authority to describe how the changes in the 80s started to take place. And what it was not a bunch of guys in a cigar-filled room saying, hey, we can undo all these things and get powerful. It was specifically the temptations brought about by computation. And it happened first in finance and also in the intelligence world, and then it happened at Walmart, and then it happened in the insurance business. Actually, the insurance business was maybe a little ahead of Walmart. But I could tell you so many stories about these events, but what happened is people realized that with the advent of cheap computing and the ability to gather a bunch of data and do, instead of having all of these women in a remote place calculating by hand, it completely changed the game. And it was an incredible bolt of thunder for the people involved. I mean, it was very dramatic. And particularly with the insurance business and with finance, it was just extraordinary, the power of this possibility. So it was essentially the temptation of the efficiency of doing the same game that had happened before. But it's not just the same thing, but more so. It's structurally different because you don't need intention anymore. And this is really what's strange about it. The role of will has completely shifted. And that's the thing that is so new that the law hasn't gotten used to it. None of us have gotten used to it. In the old days, a monopolist targeted people But these days, you have this very sessile, arm's length, kind of pure relationship. You just say, I don't know if the video on my site is pirated. I don't know. Amazon will automatically undercut a competitor, and it's not targeted, it's just automatic, it's algorithmic. So there's this very egoless, almost Zen-like or Taoistic method to total domination. It's very strange. And so the character, even though the underlying mechanism is in a way just a more efficient version of what we've seen before, the human role is quite transformed. But what I want to say, though, about the wonders of all the people sharing and everything, is that I totally agree with you. That's why we did it. It happened. I celebrated. It's amazing. It worked out. But now I'm going to come to you, Michael. Here's the thing I absolutely must object to is the notion that there's a particular technology of networking, because I was there. We hacked it together. It was kind of arbitrary. It was kind of a kludge. And in particular, something that's very crucial is that the earlier era of network design, which started in 1960, was better than what we ended up with. So for instance, networking design, the very first person to propose a digital network was Ted Nelson, 1960, Harvard. And his designs included a couple of crucial things that were different from what we now know on the web. In particular, there was two-way links. So everything would know what was linked to it. So therefore, everything was contextualized. You could track where things came from. There was also no copying because it wasn't needed, because you could always get the original. So mashups didn't require copying. And there were a bunch of things that were different about it. And we lost all those attributes. So for instance, when Tim Berners-Lee started the web a quarter century ago, it only had one-way links, which means you didn't know what was looking at what, so you couldn't contextualize things. And Google was required to scrape the whole damn thing and calculate the backlinks, then keep them secret. But they would have been there. And the reason that the design shifted is a bizarre series of awkward tales, which I could tell you if you're interested, but it wasn't like deliberation. It was all sort of haphazard. So the thing is, while I think it's true that the technology itself is inert and is both good and bad, there can be better and worse designs. There can be safer cars and less safe cars, and we can have a better web or a worse web. And we can absolutely have all the sharing and all the wonderful stuff you referred to in such a way that it doesn't concentrate power and influence so much. And the difference between what we have and what we could have that's better is in a way not that great. If we had two-way links, if a few other things happened, I think actually it would completely transform. And I can go into that. Oh God, here I'll just give you one little taste of it. If you look at it, so the original idea of the web was that it would be a no permission required way of people doing things, right? But what we've ended up with instead is all these app stores where you need permission of a central authority. Why did that happen? It's because what we've done, we were thinking if everybody shares information, then it's really democratic. What we neglected to understand is whoever has the most powerful computer, and there'll always be somebody with the most effective computer, can outcalculate everybody else and gradually build up with a compound interest-like structure, supremacy for themselves. And so then you end up with somebody controlling an app store through network effects. I'm trying not to be too technical, but whenever you do that, the particular result is that you have a winner-take-all situation, or what we call a zip curve, or what's sometimes called a long tail. But if you compare that to a different kind of network where there are a lot of people sharing freely, where it is genuinely more distributed, and a great example of that is the Linux community, then the information people see from each other and their degree of contribution creates a bell curve, which if it were monetized would create a middle class. Now, the problem with the zip distribution, everything now is turning into a zip. There's only a few winners on YouTube. There are a zillion things like WhatsApp, but only one of them is worth $19 billion. Everything turns into a zip distribution. So then society can only survive on a patronage model, and then you have, this.
Wait a minute, Jaron,
Yeah.
you're suggesting that winner-take-all thing, which is so common and increasingly so in the examples you mentioned, is a function of the particular underlying nature of...
Absolutely, it's really strange, but it actually is true that if the code were just slightly different, we would be getting a bell curve instead of a zip distribution in many cases. And that's just due to basic mathematics. And so we really kind of screwed up on that.
Huh.
Do you think is it just, are you saying it's just bad luck that we got the worst model?
Oh, God.
Not human nature? There was no aspect of just like
I can tell you the story.
the evil guys win?
If I told you the stories, if I told you the stories of how the design turned out as it was, you would say, "Oh my God, that's so crazy! I would never put that in a novel." But they're true.
The thing is, there are many ways to build a much better internet that would avoid a lot of the problems we have right now. So what are the problems we have right now? One of the problems is that, as you point out, all of our stuff lives on these big servers like Facebook and whatnot, and that gives a bunch of problems. One is that they have enormous power over sort of scooping up our knowledge and being able to monitor us and sell stuff to us and tweak and do all this, it's a casino-like nudging. And secondarily, this is a honeypot for the NSA when they want to find out what we're saying. Just one-stop shopping. Complete with a sort of a letter saying you can't tell anyone we did this, and this is what we're discovering. And so, a much more sane internet would be one that doesn't have these centralized places where we share more stuff one-to-one. And, there's a lot of people that have, historically, that's the way things were originally supposed to be when they mapped out the way the internet would work. It would be not too hard to move back towards that. I experimented recently with running what they call a little personal home server. So I set up an old computer sitting under my kitchen, and it runs all my cloud stuff. I store my documents there. It's got a little social network where I can hang out with my friends. It's all completely under my control. So if the NSA wants to find out what I'm saying, they have to come and knock on my door and hand me the subpoena. And there's no central honeypot anymore. And this is
I'm sorry, but you're not technically correct in that regard, but that's okay.
If they wanted to specifically tap in on it, they absolutely could, but they no longer have a single honeypot.
I'll bet you it's tapped.
Okay. Actually, I don't think so. I talked to a lot of three-letter agency people about this stuff, and they're actually extremely worried about home networks.
What kind of computer is it?
Oh, it's an Ubuntu computer.
Oh, it's tapped. Are you kidding? Oh my God.
Okay. All right. So.
And by many people, not just one.
We'll have to agree to disagree on that one. All right. The second thing.
You really believe the stuff we say, so that's the thing that blows me away.
Can we get a microphone that works here?
The second problem is that you've been continually conflating large-scale economic problems as if they've been created by a handful of these server firms, Like you keep on talking as if because they got together and they sort of created this winner-take-all thing, that is what has got us into our economic malaise. This isn't even close to true, and you haven't offered any evidence that that's true at all.
I can do that in a second.
Go for it.
Follow the money. Who's rich now? Where's the money? You can very easily calculate how close any person is to one of the dominant computers, and that's where the money is. It's almost universal. It's true for all money.
Hold on. That is absolute nonsense. If that were true, then there would not be enormous numbers of lobbyists and think tanks patiently working to deform every piece of legislation on Washington. If it was possible to do this with computers, believe me, K Street would not exist. But it does, and people spend a lot of money on that. You cannot escape politics.
Who spends the money? I mean, look. That's a critical point.
You're completely depoliticizing this, and it happened over decades.
Yes, 3 decades.
Yeah.
In 3 decades.
Well, actually, probably about 10, actually.
It started in 1987 with the first automated flash drive.
Yeah.
Right.
No, go.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it started in the Reagan era with the beginning of automated trading and the realization of the astounding wealth that could come about. So if you trace the money it's absolutely true that there's an incredible concentration of interventions in politics on every level, big data driven, by the way. It's incredibly true that there's an intense amount of money going into
Hold on. The decimation of labor law over decades was not driven by big data. No, it wasn't even slightly. You're just making this stuff up now. You're trying to pull everything in.
No.
You're trying to pull everything into your theory of everything here, and it just doesn't work.
No, to be clear, no. I think it's what it is the new technology applying to old human nature
to fight labor law. Go.
Wait, say what?
Tell me how big data was crucial to busting unions in the 70s.
Oh, hey, people have been hating unions forever. So I'm not suggesting.
Answer the question.
I said it started in the 80s.
Data.
I said it started in the 80s.
In the 80s, how did they use big data how did Reagan use big data to bust
No, well, actually, what started to happen in the 80s was supply chains.
Answer that question.
No, but that's a stupid question.
It's not a stupid question.
It's a totally irrelevant red herring.
It's not a stupid question.
No, because you actually, I mean, okay.
No, because you're saying the big data was behind all this.
All right, so your unified theory is that Reagan is the devil of everything. I don't agree with you.
I'm giving you a I'm asking you to answer something concrete.
No. Can I answer him?
Sure.
No. What happened in the 1980s was supply chain optimization, and that's the thing that started to hurt unions more than anything. So what happened, and actually, interestingly, you were talking about how this isn't entirely new, and you're absolutely correct in that. If you look at Marx's early writings, he describes actually a similar process. It's just much less efficient. So what happened in the 80s was pioneers like Walmart discovered that by making a big data model of everybody in the supply chain, they could figure out ways to cut people out and know exactly what somebody's bottom line was before a negotiation. That's what started to kill margins, and that's the thing that started to really kill the labor movement. So it actually was big data. Now, just to be clear, I'm not suggesting there's a unified theory of everything, and I understand it can sound like I am, but that's just because it's the particular thing we're talking about. To my mind, what information technology does is it makes everything more efficient, and according to the particulars of design, it makes some things more efficient than other things. So the tendencies, the desires of people to sort of become rich over other people, the desires of people to hoard instead of build an economy are ancient, and I'm not so just to be clear about that, I'm talking about a particular mechanism of our time that I believe can be corrected, which is why it's worth talking about. To not look at the particular mechanisms of our moment is to just be willfully blind to how we could do better.
Right, but the particular mechanisms of our moment include an enormous amount of policy. And what you're doing is heavily depoliticizing.
No. Well, see, the thing is that politics, though, has become a matter of high-tech analysis of populations in order to figure out how to best manipulate them. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary if you look at how the last elections have been run, and not just the national ones, but state and local ones too. What happens is big data analytics experts come in. So I used to be a volunteer, as a kid, and you'd sort of run around knocking on doors. You didn't know who you were going to. At this point, all of you are modeled by multiple campaigns, and there's a calculation about how to get to you. And the effect of that is very interesting. It's not that you get targeted by multiple campaigns. Instead, what happens is we split up the population into those who've been captured. It's a network effect thing. So you start to have no contest situations. You start to break the world apart.
Well, and that's heavily the gerrymandering too, which is extremely reliant on computers to do
exactly.
to do that analysis.
So we suddenly have
Totally
precision
agree.
gerrymandering. Yeah. We have gerrymandering that looks like sort of an abstract art, which is purely a big data result.
No, there's clearly computation is necessary to do all these things that I'm talking about, but they strike me as emerging from political impulses, and this is not something that.
Oh, I would agree with that.
So
There's only people here, and the impulses are ancient, and I absolutely agree with you on that. And I do think that. So just if I can agree with you in a certain way, I think that part of the reason. In a very tiny little slivery of way, I think there's one of the reasons that the impulses have come about has nothing to do with the internet, but I think we're just in a country where what had been the clear majority sort of population is becoming not so, and that's an extraordinary transition. I think it's freaking everybody out, and so there are a lot of other. I'm not suggesting that there's not a complex situation. All I'm saying is that the particular technology that's furthering it happens to make some of our worst impulses more efficient, and it doesn't have to. That's really the only point here.
On that moment of harmony, I want to use this opportunity to solicit questions from any of you out there, and a microphone will be taken to you. And meanwhile, Michael, so Helvetica or Ariel when you're writing?
Sorry, Michael, God.
No, that's fine. I just want to say you guys are both idiots. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know. I guess I feel like everything that you just said, the point where you're agreeing, all I hear is still ultimately that the Promethean idea, the idea of this technology having equal potential for destructiveness and for creation is just borne out by. I don't actually see how what you're saying contradicts
but one
that,
wonders. I think
you're saying this thing could have been this way if they had just done this and that and the other thing, and it would have been this great thing. But that isn't what happened. Well, why not? Because all these things are coming together to bring out because of its capacity for bringing out the worst. I think
Someday, if not now, I have to tell you some of the stories because they're just so amazing.
I know, but I mean, things happen the way they do because of the way we are, and I guess I think the way we are is so clearly both good and bad, just creative and destructive in the same breath.
We have somebody with a question right here. Sir, in the gray jacket.
So most of you are artists, actually, maybe all of you. And the question I had is tying those debates about systems and surveillance and concentration of power back to the individual. I mean, one of the things that was extraordinary about our country was the idea that in failure, you even brought up, Jared, the Great Depression, people could escape that failure and start over somewhere. And it was the creative spirit of a lot of people, whether as artists or just starting over again, coming to this country, moving somewhere else. How do, in the information control economy that we have, whether it's student debt that follows you, whether it's all the information people have from national security information, that how do you reboot as an individual from the control that is had from whether commercial interests or the government's interests about you and create a new identity, which seemed to be the American ideal in particular. And you see, we're in an art museum, and that was generally the thing that you could be as an American, was constantly to be someone new.
So are you saying that is it still possible to reinvent
I'm asking
yourself?
how one would do that.
Well, I can tell you, is this on? Hello?
You can have this back.
What is this on? Yeah, okay. What I always tell students is to try to avoid the little morality plays about should I do this, should I do that, but instead to be experimental with themselves in many ways. For instance, go hitchhiking for a few months. You know, do something like know yourself. And in the same way, it's not a question of is it good to be on Facebook or bad to be on Facebook or something like that. It's neither. Experiment. Like go, if you're on it, go off it for a few months or 6 months and see what happens. And you're not judging anyone else. You're not making a fuss about it. You're not making a moral point. You're just experimenting so you can know yourself. And I think this idea of self-experimentation is a good way to get to self-knowledge. It's not the only way, but in a world that's so confusing with all of these manipulative forces that have been super empowered by big data models of us, it's a necessary part of self-knowledge at the present time. And I'm kind of surprised that more people don't get that. But unless you experiment with yourself, you can't know yourself.
Is this one? Okay. I might just reinterpret the question just a little bit. And it's often occurred to me to wonder, so much of classic literature, especially novels, it is about secrets and the concealment of secrets, and that's so often the motivator for plot, whether from Dickens and Bleak House, with Lady Dedham, is that her name? And or any work of fiction that has to do with someone who has something in their past that they're trying to keep from coming out. It's such a common driver. And in this era where it's so, not only is it increasingly difficult to keep secrets like that, and things tend to get out more than they used to, but also I think people are, especially younger people, and among them the younger people that I live with, seem less interested in bothering to keep things secret that used to be routinely kept secret. And obviously things like a big plot motivator, like someone having had a child out of wedlock, which you could get a whole novel out of that, is a pretty ho-hum thing right now. But where sometimes I wonder where stories are going to come from, especially sort of novelistic type stories, if that whole plot engine thing is taken out of commission. And then the other thing that I'll say that it ties in that I haven't really had to wrestle with that one quite yet. Maybe because lately I've been writing things that aren't set necessarily right at this moment in time. But the other thing that's gotten much harder for novelists now, and this also has to do with things being invented in a sense, the way you were talking about someone reinventing themselves, starting over again, is it used to be a lot easier to fake things, to pass stuff off in a novel as real, and trust that you were going to create a certain amount of doubt in a reader's mind about whether it was or not. For example, in the late lamented Oscar Ijuelos's novel, The Mambo Kings Play Songs of Love, when that book came out, you couldn't Google and find out there was no I Love Lucy episode on which these two brothers, I forget the brothers' names in the book, on which they had a cameo appearance. And that's the thing that kind of gets the whole novel going, is this legendary thing in this family about these brothers that were on I Love Lucy. It was possible. And Oscar Ijuelos did such a beautiful job of making you believe it, that he described the episode in detail. And because he had that sort of super factual sounding element in his novel, it encouraged you to believe all the other stuff too. And I try to do something like that in The Amazing Adventures of Kavalier and Clay, where I'm right on the cusp at that point. I was writing that book in 95, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And actually literally as I was writing the book, it became much harder for me to pass things off as true that I was saying. And I was trying to create these two guys, and they created a comic book character in the 40s, and it was successful. And when I started that book in 1995, I could be pretty sure most people, if they ever got a chance to read the book, they would maybe want to take my word for it. And they wouldn't have any way of really gainsaying me unless they happen to know a lot about comics, or they had some reference works on hand where they could go look and page through and see that this character is not mentioned anywhere. You still couldn't be totally sure. And now I am actually confronted with this regularly now, where I am trying to pass off something as having happened, and I've lost that element of thinking maybe somebody out there might actually really believe this to be true. And it used to happen to me more than it does now. And people used to come up to me and say, where could I get some Joe Kavalier artwork? And now they know better. They can find out like that it's all made up, it's all fictional.
You know what that makes me think of is that actually, of course that's so, but at the same time, there are new falsehoods or sort of myths that are created online that are so powerful. I'll give you just two quick examples. One just on the economics thing, although I don't want to harp on that all night. There's this very frequent illusion that there's a vast population of, say, musicians or journalists who are making a living on the new method by promoting themselves and all that. And if you actually try to count the individuals who are able to do that, who don't have gigs at a newspaper or magazine or a label deal or something, they exist, but there's tiny numbers. I do an annual survey, and I really believe I'm thorough in getting at them, and I'm counting maybe 250 now total in the world, by the way.
250 people who what?
Musicians who make a living from internet things without relying on old media. Or old structures. And so they exist, but it's the zip distribution or the winner take all, and even those guys are not doing that well. So, but at least those people exist, but there's this illusion that there's this whole new world when there isn't. Another one, and I don't mean to rat on you too much, but this notion that that certain computers are secure and this sort of thing. There's a sort of the Linux community has this sort of cult-like quality to it where they promote various attributes that are not actually present, but it's said so often that people believe it. So in a funny way, what you might want to do is write a novel based on the new falsehoods, because then you could really fool everyone.
Maybe what you're saying is that the novel's no longer a very good way of fooling people, and it's been surpassed by this new way of fooling people that's more efficient. But yeah, I mean, I've often wondered just how much would I have to do to create just enough of a digital trail on the web that I could still fake people out, to sort of plant. If I'm saying My grandfather worked for a particular company that I invented this company, and there was no such company, and he worked for it in 1960, in the 60s. How much fake evidence would I have to create?
Wikipedia pages are easy to do,
Yeah, I'll offer to help you make one. If you want.
Yes. So, Clive, as a, you've written this entire book essentially explaining your various excitements about the goodness, the progress, all of it. Do you have a rank order because of this is specifically the thing I find most hopeful and most beneficent about digital technology?
Well, I think it goes back to what I was saying before. A lot of people, particularly academics and scholars, who spend all their days writing. They spend all their days setting down their ideas, thinking of something, putting it out, showing it to someone else, and having that really interesting intellectual thing that happens. They often don't understand what an unbelievably dramatic effect having the internet come into people's lives were, because the vast majority of people finished high school and finished college before the internet came along, and then basically never really wrote anything for the rest of their lives. That was it. Certainly nothing that they showed to anyone else. There was no venue for it. There was no vehicle for it. And when you talk to scholars of rhetoric who look into the history of this stuff, they're like, yeah, there was a minority of people writing diaries. There was a minority of prodigious letter writers. But for the vast majority of people,
but the average person wrote 5 letters a year. Or something.
Or less. Yeah, 5 was at the high end. And so there's just been this whipsaw thing that started happening. I would talk to people about how they're doing so much more of this weird self-scrutiny of what their ideas really are, because as any writer would tell you, the moment when you go from just sort of banding something in your head to the moment where you actually say, I'm going to say this to someone else, has all these really interesting transformations inside the head. It's like Cecil Day Lewis, the poet, used to say, we don't write in order to be understood, we write in order to understand. Like, we do this stuff to sort our ideas. And so every time I talk to people about, why are you doing this stuff, or why are you doing this tweeting, or why are you doing this whatever, they would say some of it had to do with communicating with other people, but some of it had to do with sort of this almost internal organization of thought that became incredibly powerful. So in some respects, I think that's one of the most ill understood aspects, because it's so obvious. It seems so huge in front of us. I tried to calculate once the amount of verbiage we write in a day, and I got to 3.6 trillion words a day, which is like 36 million books, equivalent to the Library of Congress in a day, which is sort of nuts. And most of that's crap, right? I mean, most of that, it's Sturgeon's law. 90% of everything is crap. But the 10% that's there is larger than anything that ever came before in humanity. So that strikes me as one of the most interesting and unheralded things, is public thinking and the transformations that happens to one's internal thinking. I still find that exciting every time I talk to people about it.
Michael, beyond what it's doing potentially to your children to make their adolescent nightmares worse, what about, Clive and I were talking a few days ago about how the distractions, the endless rabbit hole distractions of the internet, for a journalist, and that's not so bad, to have, because there's this social quality to gathering information. For a writer of fiction, it's mostly bad, right?
Yeah, I have a horrible problem. I have a serious internet addiction.
My name is Michael, and
exactly.
I have
that I wrestle with every single night when I go to work. And I have these great tools that have been developed to help me with that. And the one that I use most frequently is freedom.app. Which you can set, and it cuts you off from the internet for a particular period of time, and you can say anywhere from an hour to 6 or 8 hours, I think, is the upper limit. And what it does is it not only it cuts you off from anything you could think of to do short of actually not just rebooting your computer, but you actually have to power it down and then power it back up again, and that is just such a shameful, that's so low. Like to sink, like for me to think like, am I really willing to do that just to see, well, there's all the different categories. There's the things where this is how it's an addiction, because you have the rationalizations that seem to make it okay. So there are things like, well, I'm writing this scene, it's set in a New York City subway station in 1968, And I want to say that there were still chewing gum machines attached to the pillars at that date. But gee, I don't know for sure if there were. Now, how am I going to write this scene if I can't say that there was a chewing gum machine attached to that pillar or not? I better go check that. Right? So then you go to like the guy who's the world's leading expert on vending machines in mass transit systems or whatever, and he's got them all like cataloged, and like sure enough, there's the answer to your question, and you find it, or I find it, let's say, 3 hours later, I'm on the Nanny and the Professor episode guide, like, I don't know how I got there. It's like, right? It's like waking up drunk in an alley somewhere. Like, and you don't even remember how you got there. And meanwhile, now I work at night. So now it's 3 o'clock in the morning. And I just wasted all that time. That's when I have some kind of justification. That there are a lot of times where it's just that impulse to check the email or whatever it might be. So if I have the strength to turn on this app, it works beautifully. And the other crazy thing that happens is I'll be having this sense of malaise with my work and thinking like I don't feel like it's going very well and I haven't been getting that much done. And then I'll go to work, turn on Freedom, cut off the internet. 5 hours later, I've written 1,400 words. It's really good. I'm back on track. I'm in a totally, and I realize like, oh, it was just that. It wasn't something with the muse and you're not understanding my characters or losing the thread of my story. It was just that I was on a bender again the last couple nights, right? And so it has been incredibly destructive. It's been I've lost so many hours over the years to that. On the other hand, I have made so many incredible discoveries at the same time on the web of going to that guy's Subway website. Say I'm just going to look about whether they still had gum machines, and then I notice he's got this whole other thing he links to, or it leads me to an article in the archive, the New Yorker magazine archive, and I'm reading this talk of the town from the 1940s, and it's talking about this guy who works for GE who's researching lightning strikes on the Empire State Building in 1941, and that's where I am in my book, and I have this thing that's set in the Empire State Building, and suddenly I'm like, wait a minute, lightning? Like I hadn't thought about lightning, and then I do all this reading about this guy and his research and the lightning, and it ends up like a lightning strike ends up playing this really crucial role in that book. And I never would have found out about that lightning strike if I hadn't been wasting time on the internet, So, and that's happened. But somebody mentioned gambling, the gambling analogy.
Yeah,
but it's that's how it works, right? It's like you get the payoff just often enough.
There's a term of that, intermittent reinforcement. So if they make a casino one-armed bandit, so it gives you a payout every time you get bored, you'll walk away. But if they just do it every once in a while, that's what keeps you hooked, basically. And hearing your story reminded me of sometimes I think the best metaphor for what we're going through right now with all these sort of perils of distraction and sort of fascinating moments of serendipity. It's like when countries urbanized in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, because you go back and you read the stories, for the novels and the diaries written then, and people were sort of simultaneously like appalled by the distractions and the weird feeling of being crushed in there with all these other people and the difficulty of having any space and the sense of just over contact. And yet there was also these thrills of the connections that were brokered from that. And it took us hundreds of years to sort of figure out how to live in cities and in a way that we could actually have moments of isolation and solitude, and yet also have the connections, that sort of, like Edward Glaser says, people in cities are like 50% more productive, creative, measured on things like patents and whatnot than people outside of cities, because that density allows for creativity, but it also allows for this distraction and the sense of being rubbed up against with other people and ground in too much with too much socializing. And it feels like that's the exact same transition we're working through right now.
Well, I wonder about that, Jaron, in the economic history sense. I mean, you say, oh, it's like the Gilded Age or it's like the 20s. But maybe isn't it also like the Industrial Revolution at the beginning of the 19th century? And in the end, that worked out okay.
Well, except for the global warming thing, you know what I mean?
But that took a couple hundred years. I'm just saying that when we don't know yet, how to use a new technology, so we put children in factories in Manchester and they die and we cut their arms off, well, we set up laws so that doesn't happen. I mean, isn't it possible that we are at the sort of 1810 stage of this?
Yeah, that's how I think of it. That's my interest in trying to improve it and my speaking about these things. I mean, so I'm absolutely agreeing with you by my actions, utterly. But I just want to say about Michael's use of the internet, like this is what being an optimist looks like. An optimist is somebody who believes that it's not always the same, that you can actually make it better. So that's my attempt to make it better. But which, by the way, was exactly the same spirit in which the whole thing was started. We didn't start off by saying, "Oh, it's already great. That's the way it is." It really breaks my heart when young computer scientists who've only known it the way it is, like undergraduates, can't imagine it could be different. And that's the thing I'm trying to fight against. But I wanted to say, your use of the internet, your description of your addiction is in a way almost the positive model that the communities always aspire to. This is what we want people to do. I'm concerned that actually a lot of people who are stuck on it aren't using it as well as you are, because a lot of people are very concerned about their own reputation or popularity and are running on that hamster wheel saying, oh my God, I have to tweet more. Look, my rank fell. Oh, my book isn't as high on the Amazon rank. I have to go tweet some more, and I better blog for Ariana, and you keep on doing all these things. And the thing is, that's a losing game. And that kind of chasing the numbers is the one that I really worry about, which I think has consumed a lot of lives, actually. What you're doing actually I think sounds kind of cool. I have trouble worrying about you, actually.
Well, and before we go on, assuming there are some microphones that can go to question askers, are there any questions? Yes, sir.
You were talking about the Gilded Age and the era when a few people controlled all the calculations. And I mean, the classic example of this is like actuarial tables. But even then, you had the human element that was interpreting and interfacing with the rest of humanity on those. So even though somebody might give you the bad news, no, you don't qualify, whatever, there was somebody in between. Today, we're at the point where that human element has been virtually removed. Even when you get a ticket, it's from a red light camera. And what you're describing as a Zen state, to me, seems inhuman and actually sociopath that has no morals. We've abdicated our morality.
See, I'm the guy trying to be nice and kind.
Well, anyway, what I'm wondering is, do you all anticipate any possibility of restoring humanity to these decisions?
Absolutely, I do. That's why I'm working towards that. I think it's totally doable. I think we'll do it. Now, exactly the scenario, of course, is where it gets tricky. I'm positive it'll sort itself out. We'll sort it out. I'm absolutely positive of it.
Well, and Clive, that your most hopeful thing is about this, our partners, the machines.
Yeah, it was sort of, although I mean, like, I think the point, what you're talking about here really is the fact that, like, technology is a historically has been a fantastic driver of efficiency, right? And this is one of the problems, is that, like, technological systems always, and people that wield them and deploy them are always trying to find ways in a capitalist economy to try and squeeze more efficiency out of things, and that inevitably means squeezing people out of the picture, right? And so you see this over and over and over again. I live in New York City, and they've been, regularly throughout the subway system closing down the little huts where actual workers worked and just have computerized things that hand out your cards and let you go through, which works fine until there's actually an emergency or crisis, and suddenly no one's there to do anything, and it just completely falls apart. It's one of these systems that has this brittleness built in, but that's what happens when you take people out of the system. You make a brittle system. And so, this is something, again, where I have to point to, like, laws and politics as something that needs to be wielded on this level, because, that stuff happens, and those decisions are made because of that technocratic reason, that desire to wield technology in a capitalist economy to achieve efficiencies, which throws people out. And it's fought at a political level. It's fought, at the city council level, and it's fought at the state level by saying, no, we actually are going to create a more dangerous subway system if we keep on this path, right? And the funny thing is, like, the public in New York is, like, aware of this. Anyone who pushes a stroller, anyone who's older, anyone who is infirm, sees this and knows this. There's a constituency for this. This is not some hoodwink hoodwinking, technological hoodwinking that the city's putting over people. But at the moment, there's no political groundswell to grab a hold of that, but that's where that answer begins. It begins in politics.
The token clerk revolution.
Yes.
Clive?
Yeah.
I think one thing I've observed that I think is part of this mindset that we're describing is the idea that it only goes in one direction, and that in a way there's only one way of doing it, so that we have this idea that everything new that comes along has to completely destroy what preceded it, or supersede it, or is just better.
Disrupt is the term of art.
Right, that's the current term. And not only is it not true, but it's been proven, I think, more dramatically recently than in ways that people are actually noticing. So one of my closest to my heart examples would be the vinyl record, right? Where that thing was supposed to be gone so long ago and to have been superseded. And in fact, now two new technologies have since come along to supersede it, one being the CD, and the next being digital music. And it's not only is it still here, it's selling more than ever before, or not more than ever before, more than it did since 1990, whatever, when the CD seemed to kill it. And it's because it's better in some ways. It's not better in every way. Obviously, you can't take your albums on the airplane and listen to them in your seat, but it's better it's enough better in ways that still really matter, that people refused to give it up and kept and held on to it. And I think those kind of things tend to happen. That's such a small, clear example, but and I'm not trying to be overly optimistic about the state of independent booksellers in America, but it looked really terrible for a while. Like they were just gonna all die all at once. And that didn't happen. And the ones that have survived by being able to do something that you're talking about with the huts in the subway. They survived by being able to give people something that it turned out they couldn't get from Amazon.com. And now in some new, I think in the last couple of years, 5 new independent booksellers have opened up in New York City, if you count Brooklyn and 2. I mean,
Which, to this gentleman's point, is about the assertive suggestion by people who own bookstores and buyers who go to them that I want the human interaction.
And I think the human element is there in vinyl. That's part of what's there in vinyl music for me, is that human.
There's a bit of a new Veblenism or something like that. There's a Veblen-esque quality to people who are affluent enough to be able to have symbols of anti-efficiency in their lives, and they're a very small minority. I'm all for it. It's just we have to remember it's a little tiny phenomenon, even though it's big for us because we live in those neighborhoods where we have the supernatural food farmers market and the vinyl. And I love vinyl,
Although one can argue the return to bicycling is that it's harder than getting in your car, but it's a real thing.
Absolutely.
Do we have any other audience questions? Yes, ma'am.
So I want to thank the panel because you guys are really interesting and you're making really important points. So I flew in from Mexico today just to hear you guys. And but I'm actually Canadian. So I want to say to Clive, we were one of the ones in 1983 and 85 that invented online education. We've been doing a lot of study on the intellectual impact of the internet, like Roxanne and Murray and I. So there's a lot of this, but I have a real fear. And this is what drove me to come here. When I saw it in the New York Times, and right now I'm in Mexico in a really bad Wi-Fi. So it took me 2 weeks to get here. So here's my important question. Is what really scared me, because I started out as a utopian. I started out like Jaron, really thinking, wow, online education, we can democratize. We can make the world a better place. We can share knowledge. We can have Africa not only receiving it, but making it also. And I've written many books, but in the last 6 months, I'm writing a book on social media, and I'm freaked out. And I want to ask you really, I have 1,000 questions, but my real question follows on this gentleman is, when I read Kurzweil, and I read singularity. And he's saying by 2030, our meat brains will become technology brains, and that's a wonderful thing. And who this man is, by the way, Kurzweil, read the singularity, because like me, I was shocked. He is the head engineer of Google, which is also the place that has got the most robot companies in the world. How are we going to get this morality? I do think that there is this humanity. I think it's innate in us. I think we're not going to be able to keep it because the robots are coming and AI is coming. And if you read what Bill Gates said last week, he said, why should you guys don't go for minimum wage? You know, you're going to screw up the economy. And right next to that column, it said, last year, in 1 year, Bill Gates made $9 billion. So he's saying, don't get minimum wage. And I don't think they care that much about human beings. I'm really worried about that we won't be able to keep it up. So what do you say?
Yeah,
Give me my
okay.
chapter.
Oh, God. All right, so there's a lot there. We haven't even gotten into that whole side of things.
I know it's a big
So the technology world has generated a new religion, and it has all of the features of old religion, including a way to not have to die and little rituals you're supposed to do to reinforce your belief in it. And Ray's very into that. Both Bill and Ray are friends of mine. Ray and I are sort of like some weird particle pair or something, because we both had we both had mothers who were child prodigy pianists in Vienna before the war and all these weird things, and we're sort of on opposite sides of this. Artificial intelligence is a theater. You have to understand that it's actually just stage magic. It doesn't really work. And so it's not real. Okay, and I say that as somebody who makes a living. Maybe. I mean, the difference between something that might be and something that is a crucial difference. And for instance, right, there's I talked about language translation, I think, before, but right now, in order for language translator to work, it has to take examples from 1 million real-life translators every day to keep fresh, or else it falters. So it's not that there's some robot that can translate your text automatically. It's a robot plus 1 million people behind a curtain. As I was saying before, there's no example of the robot working by itself. And there are many examples that are purported to be that way, like IBM making a fuss about Jeopardy or something. And I'm very happy to go into the whole detail about how these things work. This is another thing where I've actually made some of that stuff. I can go into some of the details, but it's theater. It's very profitable theater. I've personally benefited from it. In Ray's case, it's religion. He doesn't want to die. I think that's naturally human. He has his rational worldview has killed off the traditional religions for him, and so he's made a new one that's just the same. And I always say that just to him, and he's a great guy. He's a little silly about this stuff. Bill, I have to defend Bill Gates, who I used to be furious with in the 70s and 80s and 90s just for the software quality. I made some of the worst jokes about that guy at his expense. Just horrible. I mean, I really was furious, but I've seen him do something which is just extraordinary, which is work hard to improve himself and become a good person, and it's like a spiritual journey that's really inspiring, and he's become the biggest philanthropist in history. You know, having said that, we shouldn't have. I have mixed feelings about philanthropy these days, because we can't have a society that depends on philanthropy too much, and so every single time that we celebrate philanthropy, in the local case, it's wonderful, but in the broad pattern, it's destructive. And so it's it's very hard to negotiate through that. The society needs to basically function without it. I don't know what Bill said about that. I can imagine it. There's a big debate about, if Silicon Valley's self-narrative is that we're making people obsolete, which is exactly what it is, then there's this question about, do you give them basic income? Do you just automate them and turn them into robots and then get rid of the bodies, or what? And that's what Ray would say. The actual head of technology at Google is Peter Norvig, who's a basic income guy. And we've debated about that a lot. The proposal I didn't even get into the solution I'm proposing. I'm just proposing that people get paid for the value of their information, which I think would create a natural bell curve distribution no matter how advanced technology gets. And I think that would create.
It's interesting.
Well, that's a whole thing.
I know, but it's basic. Let me crudely reduce it.
Let me quickly respond to this lady, 'cause it's a great question. I think Jaron's totally right. The singularity stuff is basically eschatological Christianity, repackaged. It's nuts. It's not going to happen to a certain extent. I don't have to worry because Kurzweil doesn't actually understand the way the brain works, and you probably can't scan it the way he thinks you can. So his predictions, you don't have to worry that prediction 1920. 30. It's not going to happen. As for Bill Gates and education, I mean, Gates is, Jaron's right, he's had this fantastic transformation to be this amazing philanthropist who's done wonderful things. The one thing that he's weak on is education. I just don't think he does not understand how teaching works. And I think he's sort of become a force for that's not always very good, because he insists on repeating this idea that teacher quality is the most important thing. It doesn't matter how many kids are in the classroom, and that is completely bonkers. But let's move into the.
Yeah, I should say, in the case, a lot of Silicon Valley people and just or digitally influenced people become hyper technocrats, where we become very trapped within whatever model seems to sort of work at things. We lose our empirical edge, and we sometimes lose common sense. And we also don't believe we need to go in there and like I do volunteer teaching in order to try to understand teaching, and I don't think there's any other way to understand teaching but to teach. I mean, I just saw this crazy proposal to try to create a tool so that anybody can write a novel with this automatic helper in 5 minutes a day for a month. And I wrote, and the thing is that all the technologists doing it had never written a book. And I was saying, so I was saying, like, write a book, then talk to me. Write a book that somebody wants to read. So like there is this problem of us making ourselves abstract. And as far as whether the singularity exists, it's all subjective. I mean, if you believe in AI, then it's real. It's like the Wizard of Oz, and people can believe it.
I don't think it's subjective. I mean, I think his whole model of how you can scan a brain doesn't really cohere to what most neuroscientists think.
I agree with that, but let's not set the singularitarian dream against what can really happen. For instance, I mean, I think in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, in our lifetimes, that there will be machines that seem different than machines have seemed, that seem more like beings. I think we're going to need...
Oh, they will, if we want to look at them that way. I mean, it's like you can suspend your disbelief. I mean, when you go into a movie, if you go into a movie and really look at what the actors are doing as actors, and the illusion falls apart, then you see how it's all taped together with duct tape and it's not real. But if you suspend disbelief and you try to fall into it and believe it, then you can let yourself believe it. And AI is just like that, and I have no doubt there'll be machines that are like that will be believable, but that doesn't mean you should believe them. And they might be very useful machines. It's all up to your psychology. It's up to your integrity to learn to not get snookered unless you enjoy being snookered, in which case, go for it. So do you want me to just...
Yeah.
Right. This is just very briefly, because this is a whole Megillah, as we say in my culture. It's a whole thing. The basic idea is that if you look at an economy measures what people do, a market economy, and then there's some result for those people, and then it repeats and repeats and repeats. So it's a measuring device. If we were to measure the height of everybody in this room, we'd get this bell curve distribution, because that's how statistics work. If an economy is not, if that were an economy, if we were being paid for our height, let's say, then there'd be a big middle class of people of average height. If an economy is not generating some sort of thing that looks like a bell curve, at least a little bit, then it's not measuring the world honestly, and instead it's measuring some other artifact within itself, which might be a form of corruption or whatever. And in that case, that thing will resonate and resonate until it turns into this other kind of curve, the zip curve or the winner-take-all curve, or something else, some other form of failure. And so what you need to do is look for a way of making a bell curve out of the economy. As it happens, when we look at some online interactions, if we were to imagine people being paid for how much information other people have been interested in, and the Linux community is one example, I can give you many other examples, but none of them are monetized currently. They generate approximate bell curves. So if those were monetized, those could create a sustainable economy. as we progress into this century, more and more things are going to have computers in the middle of them that don't right now. The cars will be driving themselves, throwing all the taxi drivers and delivery guys and truckers out of work. Factories are going to start to get automated if we don't have some sort of 3D printer that's not a hobbyist thing but can really make useful stuff. I believe robotic nursing will become important, and that this idea that there has to be a human nurse is going to be less of a thing than we expect it to be, because I'll go into that's a whole interesting conversation, but the point is there'll be more and more either hyper efficient or automated systems, but they all depend on human data in massive quantities. Some of them might get settled and might not need more data, but new ones will come along that do. So just like all those translators are needed to create the illusion of the automatic translation, there'll always be people who are supplying the big data that make all these things work. And so therefore, no matter how advanced technology gets, it's always going to be run by these systems that aggregate data from people. And if we create an economy based on how people contribute, it's not true that every single person will become a millionaire on Facebook. Only a few would. Most people, though, would find some specialty niche. And I say that empirically from observing systems that aren't monetized but are similar to ones that could be monetized. What I propose is that we find some new technology platform coming along, like it could have been 3D printers, and instead of having it come about on the Linux model where everybody shares the files so that somebody else can analyze it all to spy on people and then figure out a way to manipulate them subtly over time. Instead of doing that thing, instead people are just paid for the stuff they put on it as an experiment, not ideologically, just as an experiment. If it works out and it generates a nice middle-class distribution and also economic growth, which is another issue I can talk about if anybody's interested, then we could try it in other things and try to engender it. The technology is not hard. It's not a perfect solution. It would have its own frustrations. It's not utopian. I can go on and on about the problems with it, but it would be sustainable.
Yeah, you also believe, as I took your last book, to suggest that simply what everybody does, the data we are providing by being on Facebook and Twitter is an asset for which we should be paid something.
All right, so if we say that information is free, we're getting rid of the main tool we have for limiting the power of government, which is that government has a budget. So if we say information is free, then the NSA is infinitely powerful. As soon as we bring accountants into the mix, then we keep track of how much information people have made use of. Then we give the NSA a budget, and they can see how much they can afford to use. It'll make them smarter, because then they have to actually think and be focused. They've become stupid on the illusions of big data that I was talking about. They think the hand passes through the knee. And that's a whole other interesting story. But anyway, so the idea is that by making the government pay for data, you can size it. And also you can create these in-between situations. Right now, you have to either be totally anonymous on 4chan, which makes you into a jerk usually, or you have to reveal yourself totally on Facebook, where you don't have the freedom to invent yourself as much. You can't mythologize yourself as much. And what this does is by setting a price on your information so it can only be partially used, you create the in-between gray zone where I think personhood can exist. Okay, quick, but that's the basic idea.
Time for another question or two? Right here.
Jaron, Burley. Because we're in an art museum, I wonder where the individual creative person fits into all of this. I'm thinking about Nam June Park. He takes a magnet, he puts it on top of the television screen. Suddenly, what used to be a world of order, harmony, technical control becomes this wonderfully poetic, reordered reality. What are the aesthetics that are emerging from some of what you're speaking about here today?
Clive, you cover this world.
Yeah, I mean, there's this actually very interesting. James Bridle is a theorist he's a writer and an artist in the UK. He wrote this essay about a year ago. It was kind of clever. He talked about what he called the new aesthetic, which is like perceptual modes that come about because of all these really weird technologies we have, right? And so one example is like satellites. Okay, so in this very short period of time, we've gone from like having satellites that were militarily closed to ones that are open and fueling all these weird tools that are simultaneously useful and creepy, right? Okay, it's great to have Google Maps. You can sort of see what's going on. You can use it to plan trips. But at the same time, there's all this information being fed back to Google and thereby to the government about movements and whatnot. And so there's these artists have been sort of trying to play with the idea of the fact that we actually look through satellites with our eyes all all day long. And there's this woman, Molly, I'm forgetting her last name, she lives in Brooklyn, and she decided, she got very interested in the fact that you could zoom in close enough on Google Earth that you could actually see the tops of buildings pretty well. And so she did this project where she does paintings on the tops of buildings to be viewed through Google Earth, basically, right? So after she's painted it, she waits for the satellite to go and picture it, and then she hands it the coordinates so you can go and zoom in and see her photo, and you're looking at her photo on a roof through Google Earth, through a satellite. So she's trying to foreground something that, she's trying to take all these weird machine, highly military, highly political aspects of our everyday perceptual apparatus and make them visible. And there's a lot of, I love art like that because if we don't watch out, all these tools we use sort of become invisible. And the moment they become invisible, they can have a lot more control over what you do and how you work. So I think one of the aesthetics I see cropping up in a lot of art that I enjoy, which tends to be a little nerdier stuff, is that it sort of tries to riff with and play with the mediated nature of everyday life, and using that to sort of transform and tweak things like that. So that's one example of a really terrific new aesthetic that I've seen.
We had, the reason I really found most compelling for coming to Miami these last couple of days was the chance to sit with these three gentlemen for an hour and a half and talk about wherever we went. And we had disagreement, we had confession. I think we had it all, and I want you to thank them for being here tonight. And before we leave tonight, I want to thank Kathy Leff and the Wolfsonian and Intelligence Squared for their great convening role. Thank you very much.